Jyst eisiau gweud, ni gyd yn siarad Cymraeg, mae'r sesiwn yn mynd i fod yn Saesneg, ond os chi eisiau gofyn cwestiwn, byddwn ni'n ateb yn Gymraeg wedyn, dim problem. So we're here today. I'm Gwen Davis I'm the editor of New Welsh Review. We also run a magazine, we also run a writing competition called the New Welsh Writing Awards. And sitting here today, we have two winners of that competition. Eluned won the inaugural one and Jasmine won it in 2021. That's part of our work, and these events are part of that work as well. So we're launching Jasmine's book, Birdsplaining, which came out, just out really, because it came out at the end of January. And then that's published by ourselves, our imprint, which is called New Welsh Rarebite. And Eluned's book is published by Honor, Windstill. It's a novel. This is her most recent book, which came out in the autumn. And we will be talking about that. But I think I gave myself a difficult job in a way. I thought it would be difficult, in that we're going to talk about nature writing mainly. So we're going to be talking about Eluned's nature essays, which includes this memoir stroke travel writing from Japan, stroke nature writing book, Woman Who Brings the Rain, her essay from an anthology called Women on Nature, and Jasmine's essays on nature, and then we'll be turning to discuss the themes in this novel, which it struck me, I thought, how is this going to link up to compare nature writing and a novel? But it's very surprising how many themes were just together. And I think you both read each other's work, so you'd agree. So before that, to introduce people properly, Jasmine is a poet and non-fiction writer and author. She's written for the New York Times, The Guardian. Her book, which Ariane mentioned, Losing Israel, was the winner of the non-fiction category in the Wales Book of the Year Award. She's also written a biography of Lily Tobias, The Greatest Need, which is also a Honor title. And before that, she wrote a cultural study, Whose People, Wales, Israel, Palestine. And she's written two collections of poetry, Misappropriations and Self-Portrait as Ruth. And she teaches part-time at Swansea University. And she's in the middle of a very busy, something like an 11-stop tour for this book, Birdsplaining. So this is only the second stop on this tour. I think you might need a break over Easter. And then Eluned Gramich has a German father, a Welsh mother. She's a translator. She's translated stories from German in a volume that came out with Parthian. She's written this memoir, which I mentioned, and which won. I always say it won because I think it should have won. But it was shortlisted for the Wales Book of the Year in 2016 and won our inaugural awards, which was on nature writing. And reading it again for this, I edited this book, and I edited both books. I've already read it again and again for proofs, but both of them definitely pass the test of repetition. There's richness in both these writers, gorgeous writers. So to turn back to you, you're at the moment some sort of an apprentice in a way at the National Library of Wales. Apprentice librarian. It sounds gorgeously old-fashioned. You have an MA from East Anglia. You've written for various anthologies. As I mentioned, you have an essay on nature writing in this book. You've also got published this horror novella, called Sleep Training, which is interesting as well, but quite different and not much nature in there, apart from
mostly ghosts. Yeah.
So between you all, lots of different forms of writing, between both of you, I should say. So here we go. Oh, I should also mention you've got stories, so you're a short fiction writer as well, because you've got a story alongside Tyler Keevil in a book called Hometown Tales Wales. So we're going to the structure of today is that first of all we're going to be talking about your nature essays alongside the book. We'll be talking about your book right through, But then we'll switch fairly early on to talking about your novel. So the sort of themes that's in common, I think, to you, there's a massive list. There's bereavement, there's fear, there's belonging, change and empowerment, migration, trauma and violence, spectacle in nature, the natural process of the body, technology, voyeurism, racism, unassuming beauty in nature, the power of unassuming beauty, the abuse of power by men, the question of accessibility to nature, and safe spaces for women, and egalitarianism. So we're going to start with a couple of readings, and then we'll end at the end with a couple of readings. Well, I think 2 readings each at the end, and then the big conversation before that, and also a chance for you to ask questions from the audience. So we're going to start. We are being recorded. I don't know whether I need to mention this, but Jasmine later on, before Easter, possibly. I don't know when.
I think in April.
In April, Jasmine's contributing to a programme that Radio Wales is producing and broadcasting. The Idea, is that what it's called?
That's right.
Yeah. That'll include clips from today and one of the readings, we hope. So if I appear to be pausing unnaturally, that's why. So over to you, Jasmine.
Want me to read first? Okay. I'm going to start with an excerpt from I'm not quite sure whether to call these chapters or essays. So I think perhaps just a word of introduction about the book. It is a collection of linked essays. So in a way I prefer chapters because there are threads that run through the whole. So let's refer to them as chapters. So this is from a chapter called Mansplaining the Wild. And there's a bit of a conversation, shall we say, or a reaction to a particular set of attitudes being expressed by a literary critic, a male American literary critic. So we might come back to this, but this is just an excerpt from that chapter. And I better put my glasses on because I really won't be able to see otherwise. The conditioned romantic response to wilderness is a form of snobbery, a moral snobbery that extends to what constitutes valuable wildness or wilderness too. None of the class and cultural training primes me to respond to bog the way that I'm primed to respond with heightened sensibility to mountains or sea cliffs and crashing waves. An osprey emerging from mist above the river, or a lone fox in the frost on Mynydd Bach, that's an encounter with wildness. But a man in a pink pullover pointing at a corncrake on Iona, it's not quite the same experience. Other humans sharing the encounter ruins its potential and makes it mundane, even squalid. And what about the experience of trudging through the wilderness of endless upland blanket bog that constitutes so much mountain landscape? Yes, it erases, but not in an uplifting way. Mostly it's exhausting to navigate and makes me look forward to getting home. That's how I feel reading a great deal of nature writing. All that relentless naming and authoritativeness and certainty is a hard slog through blanket bog, and I want to be done. I know how tenuous those certainties are in me, and so perhaps unfairly I mistrust them in others. I'd trust an account of the author trying and failing to definitively identify a beetle or a wildflower or a kind of rock, or getting it wrong. But uncertainty and inaccuracy don't make for much fine feeling, or much of an account at all.
Thank you. Okay, and Eluned, you're going to read, I think, from an essay called Flowers of Wales, from Women on Nature.
So this is a very short essay, and it's a kind of memory I had of going to the Eisteddfod with my mum and seeing an event there to launch a book. And probably you will, maybe, or if you're all avid readers, you probably have come across the book because it was kind of like a landmark book about the flora and fauna of Wales. Anyway, I'll just read the extract. The flowers on the hedgerow are ordinary, discovered flowers. The red campions and buttercups, quite ordinary. The book sits on a plastic pedestal. Is history a history of esteemed men with time and money? The botanist recounts them, his forefathers, the Welsh naturalists. But it is not through these men that I have discovered the flora of Wales. I think to myself, in a room full of women, sharp and listening to the botanist's supreme eloquence. A woman showed me the red campions and the foxgloves and the buttercups, the sticky creepers and the nettles. She taught me the difference between a vixen's cry and a woman's scream, warned me not to touch the nest of blue tits in the hedge in case I forgot their mother. Yet the world of plants is not eloquent, it is Cardi. It is my grandmother's Welsh. Scramble for scratch, gwaed for say, cooker instead of fun. It is sometimes putting in an English word if you don't know the Welsh, a Welsh word if you don't know the English, and falling silent if you know neither. Thank you.
I forgot to mention just now that I think it's fair to say in terms of nature you like mountains and botany and flowers and then you're more into birds and creatures, just to mention that. So still sticking with your nature writing, can you talk about ideas of belonging home, the sort of love, a loved locality and the intimacy of place that can offer, and the idea of unsung beauty? Can't you?
Well, I think one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book is actually pay attention to and maybe give proper recognition to those modest places that I think a lot of us actually discovered during the pandemic when we were limited in where we could go, and I think all of us had to pay attention much more to what was close to home, or what was on a small scale. I think a lot of people discovered the micro worlds, the micro living worlds around them. And I think in so much of our attitudes to wilderness and wild places, we focus on these grand landscapes, and I'm trying to do something a bit different and not so much find the beauty in more modest places, because I'm not sure that it's so much about the beauty, but find the value in more modest places. And I think also there's a way in which the value that we place on the natural world has to do with how useful it is to us in some way, and that may be to do with escape from fellow humans. It may be to do with it being a playground where we walk or climb or birdwatch or kayak. And those places like bogs, like areas of blanket bog, or Cwrs Caron near where I live, they're not particularly dramatic, and they're maybe not particularly useful in that sense. But maybe we need to rethink what kind of value we place on wildness. It doesn't have to be some big, capital R, romantic landscape. It can be something much more familiar and close to home.
And it's not just the nature. There's a really strong feeling throughout your book of your bwthyn, your home, the creatures which are really your neighbours and sometimes your fellow bedfellows. Not quite bedfellows.
Not quite bedfellows. Occasionally a woodlouse. Occasionally a woodlouse, if it manages to find its way into my bed, unfortunately.
So there's a lot of talk about that, which I really delighted in, and that sense of what's a neighbour and whose porous boundaries of your walls, of the windows and doors, and who comes in. And
it's a very porous house. There's a lot of holes in the wall. It used to be even more porous before I had my windows and doors changed. There was a gap with a howling wind through it between the door and the door frame, and all sorts of things came in. And I think some people would be a little uneasy. I know some people are a little uneasy about my sense of where to draw the line between who I can share my space with and who's allowed in and who's not allowed in. I have actually not mice in my attic. I have voles in my attic. I'm a bit special that way. For some reason, it's voles that like my attic, and that's fine. They can, so long as they don't keep me awake too much. If I'm having my sleep disturbed, I get a bit annoyed with them. But it's when they come into my living space and crap on my floor and not on my bed usually. That's where I draw the line. But if they want to live in the walls in the attic, that's cool with me. I think for some people that's a bit too close for comfort. But to be honest, there isn't much choice. I mean, you can try and control, and create this sort of pseudo exclusive human space, but we share our space with spiders and bacteria and mold and woodworm, unfortunately, in old houses. Certainly wood lice. I mean, there's wood lice everywhere, whether you see them or not. So yeah, I think where I draw the line, where I choose to control who's in and who's out, is probably a little bit more porous than a lot of people. But yeah, they're neighbours, definitely.
And Eluned, you're reading this now. I like the way it's something you do in Woman Who Brings the Rain as well. You use language, different languages, and using Latin as well. So Welsh and Latin and English, and then more of a everyday Cardi Welsh, to sort of look at elitism.
Yeah, well,
in nature.
I think both Woman Who Brings the Rain and this essay, Women in Nature, just kind of reveal the fact that I'm not like an expert in nature. I think the kind of idea of expertise. I mean, I really don't know all the names of all the plants. I don't know all the names, the proper names of plants and kind of landscape just generally. I really admire people who do. So when I write with the language that I have, I suppose, and I use whatever language it might be, whether it's Welsh or English or a little bit of Japanese in Woman Who Brings the Rain. But in Woman Who Brings the Rain, it's all about Hokkaido really, so it's the northernmost island of Japan, and I stayed there for a few months and I walked around. But really it's even more, I'm seeing everything through kind of, I don't know how to describe it. Like in the first scene, Woman Who Brings the Rain, I'm in the back of the car while my homestay family drive me to their home, and they're speaking, and I can understand sort of half of what they're saying. It's almost like listening to someone speaking through in another room next to you, so you sort of get something. And it's a bit like that with the landscape as well that I was walking through, and I was both kind of most familiar to me and very strange at the same time, and trying to find my way through it. But Hokkaido is so different from Tokyo, and that's almost why I wrote the book, because I was in Tokyo for 2 years and it's like the most mega city urban landscape you can imagine, and then suddenly I was in Hokkaido, which is incredibly rural, and it just reminded me so much of Wales, because I was there in October, it was quite a wet landscape, there was lots of greenery, the colours were the colours of the trees. It was very autumnal, and it was both familiar and totally unfamiliar at the same time. So I tried to capture that in my writing. As I said, by using both English and some Japanese as well, and kanji and so on, just to have a sense of. I didn't really know what I was talking about, so I was trying to put it into words.
It's beautiful though, and we were talking in the car on the way up. About belonging, that I think that's the thing driving, I think it's true of your book as well, because you don't quite belong, or maybe you feel you don't quite belong, but you do, but you didn't really in Japan when you couldn't speak Japanese, and that's the sort of dynamic driving it. You're not quite comfortable and you're really unhappy, and then the sort of familiarity of the mountain, which has this lovely friendly name, Yote-san, which is like Mr.
I always say every mountain has it's a Mr. something.
Yeah, so Fuji-san as well. Yeah, but that sort of brings that home, that it's like the landscape became a friend and the people became friends, and that you needed the language for that.
I remember I had a friend came over, and she was actually a botanist from America. She used to work in garden centres for ages, and she came and we walked around Tokyo actually, and then she suddenly was looking at all the little bits of greenery, like the very little few bits of greenery you could find in Tokyo, and then she was just like, oh, this is an amazing plant, I've never seen this before, this is wondrous, and like taking pictures of it, and I was like, I just thought it was some green plant. I hadn't really like, appreciated it before, and then I sort of realised that my sense of kind of slightly discombobulated unfamiliarity wasn't just a city and the language. It was also things like, oh, the plants, although they look like the plants at home, are actually different. I've actually never seen this plant before, and it took somebody else to kind of really. Yeah,
it's a bit like the idea of uncanny.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The uncanniness of the flora in a way. Yeah.
I'm sure you get a chance to come back on belonging, but if we just move on, in case you disagreed what I said, to talk about the accessibility in nature, because I think that's really what we've both been talking about already, and whether that might be something that perhaps women writers in a better position to sort of take a different viewpoint on nature, not the traditional imperialistic view from above, not the bird's eye view, but the cartographer's view, a mapping tendency that scientists and travellers and ornithographers have taken. Is that just a stereotype, or do women look at nature differently?
Well, I think it would be hard to make that generalisation, except that I think women, let's say women in the West, because I'm really not going to universalise this because it would be wrong, and I don't know. So I think women in the West were very shaped by, from birth, by messages about keeping safe and risks, and I think that determines from a very, very early age the kind of accessibility we experience, let me rephrase this. I think it determines how we experience the natural world, because we're constantly having to assess risk, and there's all sorts of risks. I'm going to be a bit crude right now. I'm noticing that the hawthorn in the hedges is coming out, and for me that's a wonderful thing, because the hedges are once again going to be screens, which means I don't have to go all the way home to pee. If I'm out somewhere, I can go pee behind a hedge. Right now I can't, because they're leafless. So in the natural world is one of the few places where I genuinely experience penis envy, is to be able to stop at the side of a path and unzip my fly would be such a privilege. And it's a privilege I think that most men are not aware of, but it's humorous, but it's also a real risk. If you need, for whatever reason, menopause, or your period has started, or you just need the loo, you're at far greater risk, just as women in the city centre are at far greater risk if you have to relieve yourself in public. And I think those are some of the ways in which our experience of the natural world is distinct from that of most men, and I say most women, because there's some women who don't feel that way, some women who feel totally empowered to not do that risk assessment, perhaps. So I think in that way, yes, maybe we do have a particular sense of the natural world. In terms of whether women bring to the natural world a sensibility that's different from men, I don't know. I think that there are going to be men who look sideways at things, and there are going to be women who are much more analytical. So I'm not sure I would think about it in those terms, but certainly in terms of the kinds of preparations that we have to make to be safe definitely shapes our experience.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Eluned?
Yeah. One thing I would talk about with accessibility to nature, what struck me was when I was sort of like 10, well, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, I read lots of kind of nature writing by men. I was really into it. I read John Krakauer, Robert Macfarlane, and I really enjoyed this whole idea of just going up on your own, just walking around and having this amazing philosophical, kind of reflections on your life. It was just so expansive and I don't know, very idealistic, I suppose. But then something changed when I was in hospital for 2 weeks before I was going to give birth, and I was just hanging around. I was completely fine, but I had to hang around at Glangweely for 2 weeks on a ward. My view was of the car park, and it was great. And I read this book called Walking with Nietzsche by John Carg, and I don't know if anyone's read it, but it was in a New Yorker, and all these kind of big magazines were kind of reviewing it. And he's a philosophy professor from the US, and he just went off to Swiss Alps to walk the paths of Nietzsche and think about his life and so on, right? And I was just stuck on this ward, and I was reading this book about a man who just goes off, he went off and left his family, left his wife and his 2 young kids to go find himself in the Swiss Alps. And it was just so very frustrating, not frustrating, but almost ridiculous, the kind of difference in our situation. It just made me think now that I also have a toddler, I certainly cannot go out for very long multi-day walks in which I can enjoy nature. I mean, I have to, I've got to stay within 4 walls at home in a way. So there's that aspect of accessibility and freedoms from duty, isn't it? That you can go out and really enjoy nature to its fullest, and that kind of Robert Macfarlane walking for 2 weeks. Or the bag of apples.
Robert Macfarlane does
get
a lot of stick.
I know he does. I do like him though. I do, but there is that part of it where you just can't. I will never be able to recreate that kind of connection with nature in that sense. So, my nature writing is much more alongside the things that I usually do, or ordinary experiences.
Then maybe COVID has changed that people actually start to value what is right on their doorstep.
Yeah.
We've been talking about accessibility, but I'm reading this, I kind of went a bit mystic, because you draw on Shinto, Japanese religion, which is based on paganism, and the Ainu, who are the people who were there first, before the Japanese came to Hokkaido, and the sort of layers of the names and sort of hybrid names and so on. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the idea, the notion. This is where there's another parallel when I mentioned earlier the natural spectacle, because obviously in Japan you've got the spring blossom watch and the autumn colour watch, and there's a beautiful name for it in Japanese. But you talk about what is the point of the red in the autumn colours. And you say something that's just beautiful.
I don't remember now.
You do.
I do remember.
You say, but it's something even koyo.
Koyo.
Even down to its chemical process as a mysterious event. Perhaps it occurs simply because it is beautiful.
Well, there's lots of scientific kind of investigation as to why leaves turn red. But I suppose that's kind of the science. They don't have a definitive answer. They have lots of hypotheses, don't they? And they don't really know fully why it is, so there's a kind of mystery behind that. But also the way that Japanese language works, koyo, the 2 kanji, and ko is the first kanji and it means red, but it also can be used for lots of different things and lots of different shades of red. So it has the kanji then carry so much meaning and so many layers of meaning that beyond just the thing that they describe, And so like koyo, the second kanji is leaf, and it's also used in the kanji for words, kotoba. So our words are like leaves falling. So it's all very metaphorical and beautiful, and makes you kind of reflect on the meaning and on the thing they're trying to describe in more detail. And then there's quite a few different words. I don't know if I can find them.
So I sort of sensed it in you both that these things. You talk an awful lot about wanting to discover something for yourself. That's what you don't like. Usually men explaining to you, that's what this bird is, or I've got this recording because of this bird to make sure it'll come. And for you, that's not a genuine experience. So your own discovery is very important for you. That's the impression I get.
Yeah.
You want to do the work.
Well, it's twofold. I think I think uninvited information from men. Obviously, that's in the title. Birdsplaining is part of that. But yes, I suppose I don't particularly want my experience of the natural world to be curated by somebody else. Again, it's about what you place value on, what the things that I might pay attention to or notice are things that have particular meanings to me. So to have it curated by somebody else, particularly if it's uninvited, or to be. There's a value judgment about, a particularly rare bird or a particularly unusual bird is somehow that will carry greater value for some people than your common or garden wren or whatever. But that's not necessarily how I experience the natural world. So yes, I don't think I like. I don't think I like it to be curated for me, but that doesn't mean that I don't enjoy other people's expertise if I'm looking for the expertise.
You talk about various sort of spectacles or tourist experience based around like the Osprey project in Dovey Valley.
Yes, there is a kind of a division, I think, in particularly in birdwatching circles. Those really dedicated birders who go after rarities. I mean, we have a lot of social stereotypes about birders and birdwatchers and twitchers, and we have a lot of bad language about them as well. I heard, and just the other day I was listening to Radio 4 comic half hour, 6:30, and again birdwatchers were the butt of the humour. The ultimate boring is a birdwatcher. So sometimes, unfortunately, birdwatchers kind of give some credence to that assessment, and so yes, there's a large proportion of really dedicated birdwatchers who probably wouldn't go to the Dovey Osprey Centre, for example, to see ospreys. There's somehow a sense of the experience of accidentally seeing an osprey or going somewhere in the hope of maybe seeing an osprey, and yes, seeing an osprey carries more experiential value than going somewhere where you're absolutely guaranteed to see an osprey. So the spectacle, the conservation spectacle, feels, and I share this. I mean, I'm not particularly proud of my sharing this, but I share the sense that it has an element of the zoo. It is spectacular, and therefore it is also in some way less valuable, and it's also shared. And I think that the rareness of the bird is probably maybe not even as important as the rareness of the experience of seeing a rare bird. So if you're going to a place where everybody can be guaranteed to see this rare bird, an osprey, because it's nesting, then somehow that doesn't have quite the charge of, I don't know, seeing a hen harrier by accident, by chance, because and also there's a sense of, pride too, that you made a judgment about where to go. You made an assessment of where something might be seen, and you succeeded. So there is a hunting aspect to bird watching as well, which I think the spectacle, doesn't deliver in the same way. And yet the spectacle, the conservation spectacle, is what makes the wild accessible to a lot of people who wouldn't necessarily have any access or even any knowledge. And sometimes that's where your engagement with the wild begins. So there are value judgments and the sort of snobbery around these sort of distinctions that I try and explore.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a difference. I don't want to fall into stereotypes about Japanese culture, since I know very little about it anyway. But it seemed to me that when you talk about, in a few sentences actually, about the difference between the spring blossom spectacle and the autumn colours, that it was a shared thing, more deep, widely across society, because it's embedded in the language as well, which I don't think Osprey Project, W Project is.
No.
And so after this we'll move on to talk about Windstill, the novel. But just to come back to those autumn trees again, you say in Women Who Brings the Rain, Koyo is about the necessity for change and the mesmerising work of metamorphosis that has, both together, both those spectacles are about transience, but this is more of a positive, more resilience in the change, that sort of idea. And with that segue, we're now moving to Windstill, and we'll carry on talking about birdsplaining. But again, what struck me in both your writing is, both these books, is the way that natural processes, emotions especially, are in the body. They're natural processes in the body. I mean, that is obviously true, but I think people forget that. And it just really struck me. So you're both also talking about the same emotions, I think, obviously in different contexts, very different contexts. You both write about abusive relationships. Yours, two levels, one at the military level in terms of World War II, and yours, your relationship in the past. Very delicately write about that, and I think the themes are kind of in the other essays building up. So as with emotion, so we've got fright, freezing, the old cliche about fight or flight, but I think freezing is also there. Both of you, your protagonists, is sort of numbed, and then you were numbed during your experiences. Fear, anger, aggression, sexual violence, avoidance, grief. Those are the sort of big themes that you both talk about. Could you talk a little bit, Jasmine, about, I don't know how you approached those big themes? Did the theme come first, or the situation that you wanted to write about in terms of weather or climate change? Or
I think I wanted to. The background is that I wanted to explore and write about fear. Actually, I wanted to challenge fear. There was a time in my life a few years ago when I felt like I had at a certain point been really adventurous, and I had just gone off and done stuff, even if it was a bit daunting. And I just found my world shrinking, and phobias growing, and fears preventing me from doing stuff, anxieties. And I finally got really tired of this fearfulness about people too, fear of being judged, just felt like there was a kind of a shrinking going on. And I was determined that for a year I would do things that frightened me, even though they frightened me. So afraid of heights, I started climbing. I'm still afraid of heights. I've got a wasp phobia, so I try to confront this wasp phobia, not the kind of, exposure therapy sort of thing, but to try and get to grips with what is this all about. I developed quite a fear of travelling, though anybody who's read my previous book will know that I took off for the Middle East without, I travelled in quite dangerous circumstances without really much of a thought about it. So something had changed, and so it was in doing those things and starting to write about this, I was exploring fear and starting to grapple with the fact that part of it was the long aftermath of domestic violence and living with somebody in fear of somebody for 10 years. And it just had a long after shadow. And these are experiences that are quite far in the past. So yes, I think more and more we know about how trauma is in the body, and the body remembers, and came up in all sorts of unexpected ways. So yeah, that's the background to it. But in terms of freezing, fight or flight, climbing really taught me about that. There were times when I could not move, And the wonderful thing about climbing is that once you're committed, you just got to keep going. You've got to get it under control. You have to control your fear somehow or other, because whether you're going back or you're going on, you've still got to climb. So I haven't got away from any of my fears, but I know them better, certainly.
Which emotion would you like to pick?
Yeah, I guess I'll just talk a bit about Windstill and Laura and Daniel's relationship. So one of the major kind of, I don't know, plot points or narratives in Windstill is the relationship between the main character Laura, who's a girl in the early 20s, and her ex-boyfriend Daniel. And yeah, I mean, what happens is that Laura stays with her grandmother after her grandfather's died, and she's in Hamburg with him for a week, with her grandmother for a week. And Daniel, who she's broken up with, decides to follow her to Hamburg and sort of turns up on the doorstep because he thinks that she's going to change her mind, that she really wants him to be there, but she just hasn't expressed it directly. And so, you know, in a way, he's just yeah. And Laura's reaction to this is just to do nothing for a long time. And part of the novel is really Laura coming to terms with that, well, developing her own voice in order to really tell him, you know, that this is enough, that she's had enough. But she's really unable to. She kind of, as you said, she's numb, she's kind of frozen. And when I was writing Windstill, I did do a bit of reading around the subject, and I read really interesting kinds of essays on subjects of kind of unjust sex, unethical sex, and the kind of the boundaries where, you know, where you can't really say it's rape, but something's wrong. There's something that's not quite right. There's pressure. There's a power imbalance at play. So there's one feminist writer called Anne Cahill, and she writes about this in a lot of detail. And one of the things that she said really kind of, yeah, it struck a chord with me, and this is very true for Laura, that she writes that, you know, women generally, obviously I'm talking generalizations, but women generally are socialized to be accommodating and to kind of keep the peace, and to, you know, you're not going to have arguments every 5 seconds. You're trying to make everyone happy all the time and that kind of thing. And, you know, you can see that also with, you know, toys and clothes for girls, where it says like, oh, be happy on the jumper or whatever, or like, you know, that kind of sort of stuff, like positive power, whatever it is right on these jumpers. But the idea that you're always going to be accommodating and, I suppose, submissive in some ways, that women are socialised to be that way, until it comes to a situation where there's sexual violence involved, or rape, where women suddenly have to change completely and or to say no very forcefully, and, you know, maybe be violent and in self-defense and so on. So you're really asking women to suddenly completely change who they are and how they've been socialised. So, you know, maybe everyone already knows this, but for me this was like, oh yeah, that's actually really true. You know, it was a real like moment where I kind of thought that was really a powerful thing, and that's definitely true for Laura, that she's kind of been taught to always make everyone else happy. And so she doesn't really want this conflict with Daniel. She avoids it and avoids it and avoids it, and just hopes that he will go away. She's just trying to ghost him, basically. And then right at the end, something happens where she just can't, there's nowhere else to run to. She just can't ignore him anymore. And so there is a kind of reckoning at the end. But yeah, so I was really interested in that idea of, so you see also, sorry, one more thing, you see a lot of like, in fiction, or especially YA fiction, you know, this kind of stereotype of the very, very assertive woman, that the main woman is always feisty, and she like gets her way, or she'll like, you know, fight against the powers that be, you know, and I love those kinds of novels. I read a lot of them, and I'm always gunning for the main character. But I think in real life maybe there's many more women who are really not like that, and who find it hard to stand up for themselves, hard to express their feelings. And I think I wanted Laura to kind of reflect that aspect of things.
Can I just say, I think that's this wonderful moment, without giving anything away, in the novel, where Laura does does stand her ground, does manage somehow to overcome that frozenness, and it's reinforced socially. It's reinforced by other people around her. So it's a wonderfully it feels so true in the novel. You know, it's not just it's control or violence or a woman being in some way dominated in public. I think there is this change, that people aren't sort of turning a blind eye anymore, and that feels that it's validated what she, just that small moment of empowerment that she manages to grasp, and it gets socially validated, and that felt so true to me. It felt like, and it was a beautiful moment in the novel, but it's.
Yeah. You're going to read that at the end, I think, aren't you?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Well, I am going to give something away, but people will forget, I think. That you mentioned Daniel, and the sort of the reason that they split up in the first place is because he films her sleeping, and then at that point she snaps, but then it gets worse because it's shared. And obviously I want to talk about technology, really. Both of you again are grappling with this in relation to bodily things, bodily people, humans, creatures, that it multiplies. Technology objectifies, it multiplies, it is used for commerce. And do you want to talk about that in terms of, without going back to the you can go back to the Ospreys if you want, but the social media threads on, on anthropomorphism, giving cute names to birds, and
well, there is in it's certainly in bird terms, there is this pics or it didn't happen thing that goes on in bird watching. Now you've got to document that you saw every single bird you saw with an image that you post on some blog or some your own blurry blog, or it's just a new kind of list keeping. But to me, what that seems to do is to get between you and your experience of the bird, or you and your experience of whatever. And we're all subject to that pressure, aren't we, of documenting everything with our bloody mobile phones. And you see some really extraordinary thing going on, and everybody's experiencing the thing through their phone that they're holding up, and I don't know what happens in that situation, what it does to us mentally. Are we outsourcing memory as well? If we don't experience things in an immediate way, but it's always mediated by our own choice through some sort of, it's not just about technology, but it's about record keeping as well, isn't it? Do we have access to that experience, really? That's what I worry about. So, yeah. But then I use binoculars. Is it so different? I don't know.
Time's ticking on, so I've just to say briefly, when I was reading the book, looking for these themes of technology and so on, there's a beautiful section where Laura's sort of escaping, really, or she's going away home on her own, away from Daniel, and he moves through the Hamburg. The book didn't mention the book set in Hamburg, through the Docklands, where humans and machines sort of start to merge, and then there's a lot of about the medical stuff, the medical themes as well in both your books. But whether technology does have an upside, though, in that context. So just to return again to accessibility, but this time with a little bit of attitude. So move on to themes about redress and empowerment. We've talked about women. We haven't talked so much about different communities' access to the natural world. If you want to talk a little bit about that, empowerment.
Yeah, I think again it's a point of change. I mean, I have one essay in the book about the experience of being a person of colour in rural space, and dealing with the ways in which rural space and wild space in the UK is very much white space. And in fact, I think since I first drafted that essay or that chapter, so much has happened in the intervening couple of years. There's been a huge change in recognition that people of colour experience barriers in the natural world. People with disabilities experience barriers in the natural world. It's not universally accessible, that our ideas of conservation are geared very much towards a certain small segment of society. Just today I read that actually the Audubon Society in America, which is the equivalent to the RSPB, I guess, sort of, is changing its name because 2 of its chapters have repudiated any association with the name Audubon. Audubon was a slave owner, among other things. So, yeah, we've got the John Muir Trust, for example. Are they going to change their name? I don't know. John Muir also had some very, very troubling attitudes to Indigenous people in the States. So, yeah, I think it's really changing. I think in a way, this is just this sort of transitional moment, and I think conservation organisations in the UK have really grasped that issue and are really addressing it. And there's lots and lots of new emerging groups, birders of colour flock together. So I think there is recognition, but it's been a long time coming.
Okay, and there's bird names for birds.
Bird names for birds, yeah. Looking at the ways in which some people are memorialised through bird names, and I assume this is with other parts of the natural world as well, but where those people also have troubling imperial or racist attitudes on record. Do we need to rethink those names? Do we need to? Does there need to be redress? What about the invisible, unacknowledged people who contributed to scientific investigation and helped all those explorers and naturalists make their own name, but haven't been recognised themselves? So I think there's a lot of work still to do. But I think the change is happening.
Yeah, and the book includes positive examples of different people who did exactly that. Girls and Palestinian.
Yeah. Well, I in Losing Israel, I wrote a little bit about Tristram, who was an English naturalist from Durham, who really recorded the birds of Palestine in the 19th century for the first time, and he's really recognised for that, and he did an extraordinary job. I mean, he's still celebrated for it, but he also has some really, really troubling attitudes. And one of the people who helped him both find specimens and get other people to collect specimens for him, he does actually name. And so in the book, I try and give credit where credit is due to that one individual called Jamil in Palestine, without whom Tristram would not be known for what he's known for.
I think he'd also be dead, wouldn't he?
He would also be dead, yes. Jamil saved his
but
life. Through a moment of ingenuity, he saved his life, yes.
Returning to women then, I think this might be the last question because we're coming up to time. But, going back to women and safe spaces, can you tell me the way, how you approached creating sort of this atmosphere of numbness, I suppose, going back to that, for Laura in her different settings in the book, the different ways she was sort of trapped?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the first way that she's trapped is that she has to look after her grandmother for a week in her grandmother's house. And we were talking on the way here about the way the book's evolved, where the first drafts, it was just Laura and her grandmother in this house for a week. And then I was like, oh my God, I don't think anybody could read this. I have to introduce it or get them out of the house, to another character or two, So yeah, in that sense, that she's very kind of trapped, and also trapped in the sense that she has to look after her grandmother. Her grandmother's kind of not coping very well after the death of her grandfather, of her husband. and yeah, it's kind of unraveling a little bit. And also, Elfrida, the grandmother, is also used to having a strong man in her life. Always had her father, then her husband, and now she's on her own with a 22-year-old granddaughter, and she's just doesn't know what she's supposed to do every day, what she's supposed to eat, what she's supposed to wear. There's always somebody to tell her how to do these things. So Laura's sort of trapped with her, and then they go. I suppose the main place they like to go. Elfrida's also hypochondriac, so they always go into the doctor's office very often. And there's another man who tells them, what to do. And then, Laura doesn't really have the space to herself. Even when she's in the bedroom, Daniel comes in the night to wake her up, which is a very frightening experience. And so, and even in the public space, hopefully we're here now, when she goes to get the train to kind of escape and go out for the night, he's still following her. And, that's really the point where she just realises, this is never going to end. Everywhere I go, even on a train station platform, he's turning up. Because he just can't hear the no. He every time she says no, he hears yes, which is sadly quite a common problem, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, trying to read Ariane's body language because it is 7:30. I've got another question to ask. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah. Oh, hiya.
I was just thinking about the very different forms of the work that we're discussing, and I kind of had a question about that. And I was thinking about Windstill. There's so much in the DNA of the novel which is about sort of going towards a sort of romantic resolution, and this novel does exactly the opposite. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about it. So I just wondered if you could say something about the form, and maybe a question about the form of the essay, like how not to explain things.
With Windstill, I sort of try to, in terms of the form, it's sort of developed with lots of different kind of versions of drafts, and I try to kind of limit it by just setting it within one week where sort of everything happens. But then, as you said, I remember Gwen asking me we're going to read something at the end of the novel which is uplifting, and I was looking through the end and I was like, which bit is uplifting? Because at the end, as you said, it always comes to this very happy conclusion, but something happens which is at the end, I won't give it away, but which kind of gives the ending which is not quite completely happy. I suppose there is a sense of resolution, but something else happens at the end which means there's a bit of, I don't know, there's a sort of some sense of sadness, I suppose. And I guess I wanted that just to be, I don't know, I felt that's more true to life, not that that's always going to be the end goal of everything you write, that it has to be exactly like life, but it's more true to life for me that, that things don't suddenly wrap up very nicely. And, although a character might develop, Laura develops her voice by the end, she's not completely, she hasn't completely found herself, right by the end. There's still a lot of work to go on, and Daniel definitely has a lot to learn still. Unfortunately, he goes off with Gerald, who is not a very good influence to him, in a car. I don't know where they're going to go, Berlin, I don't know, somewhere to make mischief. So not everything is kind of wrapped up by the end.
But I think you really successfully resist, I don't know if it was conscious or not, there's nothing didactic about the novel. I mean, it's dealing with an issue that is, you could so easily fall into, a tidy lesson at the end. It could so easily follow that kind of path. But you hold back. And so the ending is so much more subtle, but you present that experience of controlling behaviour so sympathetically and so delicately that there's nothing didactic about it at all, but the inferences are so overwhelmingly clear. So I think you do it incredibly delicately, successfully.
Do you do that as well? the second part of Zoe's question?
Oh, the
didactic thing.
Oh, well, I hope I don't. I really hope I don't. I hope I'm not didactic. I mean, I really am trying to find a different way of exploring knowledge and presenting what I know through what I know, rather than through some kind of learned information that I'm then want to pass on. So it's the birdsplaining, as the title is also me trying to offer a different way of exploring how we know things, and I know my own experience. I'm not going to universalize it. It's not everybody's experience, but maybe using that experience as a jumping off point to think about ideas, to reflect on, what you can draw from that is a slightly different way of approaching knowledge and sharing knowledge. And it's not, it's not that I think women's experience necessarily is more important than sort of technical knowledge. That's not what I'm saying at all. But it's a way of trying to share knowledge that's not in an authoritative way, not claiming authority other than the authority of my own experience, which we all have authority about our own experience, and it's all equally valid.
Are there any more questions?
I'd quite like to say something, because I've been listening to two friends who've gone on holiday together, one man and one woman, man's experience bird watching. And the woman said to me privately that she had actually not to me, that she had to do some mansplaining. She had to deal with mansplaining. So this, then not long after that, I was in the bookshop and I saw this tablet. This is really I had a gorgeous illustration. And I get that. And really, I just wanted to thank you, because I think you presented a woman's experience, and you spoke about your feelings and things that happened when you were in the woods, particularly looking for night jars. That was a really lovely chapter. And how you felt in the dark when someone came behind you, a man, and how in fact he kept his distance and respected you. And it was just so refreshing to read and so honest and inspiring. It made me want to walk in the woods at night.
Wonderful.
I asked the knowledgeable bird person about night jars, and so I haven't finished it. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for that. That makes it so worthwhile that you want to go out at night as a result of reading. What a wonderful gift to me as an author to tell me that. That's wonderful. And maybe the mansplaining bird watcher maybe it's a good present for him. Oh, good.
I think I will stand up for mansplainers, though. I think along my journey, through a career in conservation, I have been so grateful for knowledge shared by people, and most of them men, especially at the start of my career. So I think we always need to remember that there are very knowledgeable people out there and who are so generous with their knowledge, and their influence is huge. So, yeah.
Can I respond to that? And I'm really glad you said that, because absolutely. And where would any of us be without that? And people are incredibly generous. I don't want to give the wrong impression. It's uninvited sharing of knowledge that isn't even necessarily accurate knowledge, and the assumption that the person you're sharing it with doesn't know what you think you know. I think that just to be clear, it's not the sharing of knowledge altogether, but that presumptuousness about women not knowing, about that experience. I think that, and it's not just men, and I can be as splainy as the next person. Can I give an embarrassing example?
Yeah.
My brother, who currently lives in Israel, posted. We've got a family group on WhatsApp, and he posted a picture of spring wildflowers, and he wrote something exclamatory about poppies. So my brother's very urban, and my mother. This is when my mother grew up, and she loves the spring wildflowers from her childhood. So I'm thinking, oh, Guy, my brother's called Guy. Oh, poppies? I don't think so. Those are anemones. And then my mother responds before I do. Well, they look a bit, those aren't, not to tell you what I know, Guy, but I mean, they're not actually poppies. And they look a bit like anemones, but actually ranunculus. Thank goodness I didn't say anything. But no, I mean, it's we're all just as capable of uninvited expertise that's wrong. So yes, thank you. I absolutely, people with fantastic knowledge about the natural world are wonderfully generous with it.
Thank you.
I say that I've read both books and enjoyed both of them, and interviewed the two ladies about their books, which was most enjoyable. But they were both of the books, I think, were rather difficult at times to read as a man. I hope that I'm, not to the right of Genghis Khan, but sometimes I did feel slightly uncomfortable. And I think I told Ellen that when I interviewed her, that she was a little bit hard on Daniel.
I disagree. Because we were talking on the way up.
Because Daniel didn't have a clue.
Yeah, that's true, but I think she does show that. And she starts the story with him. So you're drawn in with Daniel. And you were saying about the millennials.
Yeah.
I
think we talked about it as well. Like I found the readers, the people who read it, first there was a sort of generational split between millennials and then, Gen Z, the early 20s. I do find Daniel, a complex character. I feel sorry for him. He doesn't have many good things in his life. His mum's left, his dad doesn't take care of him as he should. He doesn't have many role models to tell him how to behave, how to cope with a breakup. He doesn't have anybody to tell him how to cope with that. And unfortunately he meets Gerald, who is another character in the book, who is a very bad influence on him and doesn't really help him, doesn't give him the tools of how to cope and to see things properly, And yeah, so that's how I feel as well. And then younger readers that I know, they absolutely hate him. They were just like, oh no, he's evil, he's a villain. Like, no, nothing. They were really anti him, and I was surprised. I was like, oh, I thought I painted a more complex character.
He's not a villain, but he certainly has problems, and he has, as you quite rightly saying now, he's got history as well, hasn't he? And then Birdsplaining, really enjoyed it, as I've told you before, and I'm a very, very ambitious bird watcher. I get as much pleasure. I've seen two ducks sitting outside my front door today as I do when I see a hen honey or something like that. Or the robin disappearing into your hedge, as you put on Twitter.
On Twitter, yes. That's a doomed nest. It's wet and they've given up already.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they've figured out.
Yes, a terrific book. I lent it to a friend who really didn't enjoy the first essay, and I said, you've got to stick with it. So he's promised that he will stick, but you upset him by talking about this man in trousers with pockets.
I told you about pockets.
Pockety trousers.
Yeah,
oh dear.
I just laughed because I hate them. And
Let me tell you, there were a lot more pockety
Yeah, I
trousers
got
in
them all
the
out.
book before Gwen took them out.
Good for you, Gwen.
So,
Both are terrific reads and really enjoyable. Yeah, Gloria.
okay, I think time's ticking on now, but if we've got time just to finish with the readings. 2 short readings from both of you. Eluned first.
So this is the scene at the train station where Laura has kind of had enough. And so, yeah, he keeps on asking her to change her mind, and then the only thing that she can think of to say to get him to go away is this. So, I was with someone else last night, she heard herself say. Daniel pressed closer. I know that doctor friend. Oh, he's more than a friend. Daniel didn't move away as she hoped. The zip of his open hoodie banged against her thigh. She could smell his sweat, his armpit close to her face. There was a brief silence in which she could sense him processing her words. Did you sleep with him? She nodded, eyes still closed. It was easier that way. Okay, Daniel said calmly. You know that makes you a slut, right? Okay, she whispered. It would be over soon. He grabbed her. She opened her eyes in surprise. He pinned her arms against the wall, fingers digging into flesh. You're a slut. It's not okay. Talking through gritted teeth, spit landing on her cheek. It's not fucking okay. He banged her against the wall. Once, twice, 3 times. Stop it. It was the same expression she'd seen the night he came to her room and stuffed his fist into his mouth to stop himself from crying. You slut, you crazy bitch. He was flushed, sweating. The darling, boyish hair matted to his forehead. She asked him to stop. Please. Why wasn't it over yet? She thought it was over when she pushed him on the platform, when she told him to go home. But no, there was always another stage, another attempt to get at her. Had they reached the final stage now? The stage of physically forcing her to do as he pleased? The last stage, or the one before last? He was shaking her, his body positioned so that no one else in the carriage could see her face. Couldn't be sure they weren't playing or embracing. His grip was painful, but it was his expression that frightened her, feverish and strange. She asked him to stop. Slipping her hand into her pocket, she kicked his shin, managed to push him off for a second, long enough to hold up the pepper spray. Leave me alone. The noise in the carriage suddenly cut out. She felt everyone's eyes on her, the drinkers, the happy party-goers. They were all involved now. She pointed the pepper spray at him like a gun, only her arm was trembling, and there was a strange sobbing sound coming from her chest. Don't come near me. I'm just going to go just to the end. This is just sort of final little paragraph where we see Laura finally in a safe space, I suppose, with her grandmother. Elfrida didn't seem to notice that Laura was practically undressed. She had noticed the bare leg swinging lazily against the side of the armchair, one foot touching the hem of her grandmother's dressing gown. That would normally have earned an exclamation of horror, not even a pair of socks. Laura said quietly, You didn't wake me up last night. I thought you would. I slept well, said Elfrida. I didn't have any nightmares, not one. Maybe he thought I'd been through enough and left me alone. Okay, that's good. The bathroom is clean, Oma said. I cleaned it. Properly, with cleaning fluid. Blood is the worst for stains. Laura removed her hand from her grandmother's shoulders. She said, in a voice that was the closest to authoritative she could summon, Go and get ready. I'll take care of everything else.
I'm going to read a section from a chapter called The Regard of Equals. I'm ashamed of my fear in all the forms it takes. It seems like a terrible weakness. It enrages me to remember how cowed I used to be, how afraid I was. Enrages me that I should ever have been made to feel that way, that any woman should feel that way. And yet when I see it in another woman, my rage turns on her, not on the man who's got her under his control. I recognize it in other women instantly, the way I might recognize a known bird. At least I think I do. I'd not be able to say what precisely I rely on, what features, what visual or oral or scent markers, what posture or plumage or movement come together in a moment's impression to tell me domestic abuse. But I know it with what both the components of the word recognition suggest, a previous knowledge re-experienced. And without recognition comes a miserable rage. When we lived together, I used to fantasize wildly, intemperately about his death. His death in a train crash, in a terrorist attack, in an earthquake. I didn't wish him pain or suffering. It's not that I wished him dead. I just fantasized about an escape through disaster for which I was not responsible. The only escape that was possible. Because even if I left him, it would not end. Not because he'd pursue me or threaten me, but because he would continue to exist, would continue to judge me and be angry, and I'd be abject all my life. My life would be shaped by trying to repudiate that judgment or appease that anger. He'd never not matter because he knew me, and I could only be free of his anger and judgment in his approval, which I could not ever earn. In fear of his anger, I externalized approval like a child. I sought his approval, and seeking it accepted that I could never have it, because seeking it made me abject, and therefore not worthy of it. As petitioner, I re-established precisely what I wished to undo. This was the trap from which the only escape was actual escape. In my waking life, I fantasized about a disaster that would provide my escape. In my sleep, I dreamt of the aftermath of disaster, which was the huge cost of escape. I dreamt terrible repeat scenes of war, of death camps, of the devastating earthquake that was always still to come. All communication would be down, and I'd find a public phone, but it would be missing some of its buttons so that I could not dial 911 or 999, or it would turn out that it was not a phone but a calculator. Or I'd find the phone cord had been torn from the box, its end frayed. It would be a phone box in an urban street, gum-encrusted, stinking of urine, full of broken glass and detritus. Or the phone box would be empty. There was simply no means of communication, no way to ask for help, for rescue. And when I woke, I'd realised that I had to update our emergency numbers, that I had to do an earthquake drill. I needed to buy water treatment tablets and replace the old tins I'd put aside in the earthquake supplies box on the front porch. I'd lie there in the flood of waking relief, haunted still by disaster, in wonder at my mind's capacity to remind me of my responsibilities, to remind me of jobs not done, of the denial that everyone in earthquake country lives with. For to be prepared for an earthquake, which then, years ago, meant keeping a radio with charged batteries, enough food and water for 3 days, blankets, torches, the tool for the gas shut-off, requires that you confront the real definite future earthquake on the Hayward or San Andreas fault, not sometime in the next 10 or 30 years, but imminent, not the possibility or probability, but the certainty of it. And to do that is to confront an impending disaster, at which your first and strongest reaction is not to prepare, but to escape. It sets in train an impossible sequence of thought, that you cannot live in this dangerous place, you must move, but you cannot act immediately. You cannot quit your job and pack up and go elsewhere in that moment of urgency, and so it becomes less urgent. And then it quiets a bit into something to think and talk about, and then settles into something to put off, so that again in a matter of mere moments, an imminent disaster from which you must escape becomes a set of tasks you ought to see to, but don't, or which you begin and never finish. We should review our earthquake plan, you might say that night over dinner. Or in the supermarket that afternoon you might select 6 tins of beans or new batteries. And soon enough, when everyone's ill and the house hasn't much food or you can't be bothered to cook, you open one of the tins and heat up the beans and don't replace the tin. And then, needing batteries, you raid your incomplete, scattered, poorly organised and out-of-date earthquake supplies and don't think about replacing them until the next dream of catastrophe. At no time did I confront what all the dreams were really telling me. They were not about the dangers I lived in, the muttering raw background of my fear, the labyrinth of his rage, but the danger that I posed to myself. I could not face my desire for escape because I would have had to act on it and be responsible for the consequences. And so my mind constructed terrible dream escapes of disaster beyond my control, for which I could not be held responsible, and about which I felt terrible, and I'd wake in a flood of relief that there was no war, no fire, no earthquake, a relief that I was safe, though I was not safe. This chapter starts with seeing a pair of polecats in my garden. And one of them runs off, but the other stays and looks at me. And it ends with the polecat too. You don't think about fear in the moment of fear. Sometimes it's only afterwards, thinking back, that you even recognise that what you felt was fear. In this moment, looking at the polecat, nothing goes through my mind at all. He faces me unafraid. He looks at me and apprehends me in his polecat cognition, assesses how I smell and how I sound, and finds me uninteresting after all. He's more interested in getting it on with his girl. Anything I think about this encounter is projection, as my response to those women was projection. Of course I'll commit that heinous crime, anthropomorphism, if I attribute anything to him at all beyond acknowledging his existence, observing his appearance and what he does. But that is to objectify him, to reduce him to a thing, not a living creature to whom I respond in all the flawed and inadequate ways that I've learnt to respond. I know that this is a polecat interrupted by me in the act or anticipation of mating. I can know nothing beyond that, perhaps. But there's still my experience of him. He looks at me without fear, and I experience his gaze as the gaze of an equal. I do not feel recognised or reacted to or identified. I am simply observed. My response is nothing like my familiar fear. It isn't fear of how he sees me or what he might do. It isn't fear of danger, and it certainly isn't an annihilation of self in the face of wildness. It makes me for an instant pricklingly alive, because he looks at me in a way that upends the relationship of threat and fear, of power and weakness, of dominance and submission, before he turns away and slips down the bank in pursuit of what I have so rudely interrupted.
And that's the end, folks. Diolch yn fawr, Eluned a Jasmine.